Blood-curdling facts that you wish you never knew. Hundreds of thousands of bodies have either been lost or buried at sea, so every time you swim in the ocean, you're basically bathing in a graveyard. Chainsaws were originally invented for childbirth. Female mummies in ancient Egypt were always decomposed more than the male ones, and this is because the male bodies were embalmed a lot sooner while the female bodies were kept at the family home until they started to decompose a little bit. And this was to prevent people from having sex with the dead female bodies. Vlad the Impaler was called this because he would place his enemies ass first on pointed poles that would slowly skewer them to death. Fatal familial insomnia is a disease where a person literally cannot go to sleep no matter what they take or what they do. The symptoms get progressively worse until they die of exhaustion. And for the last one, you might want to look up who invented blow-up dolls. There was a woman in the 18th century named Mary Toft who shoved dead rabbits inside of her and later acted as if she gave birth to them. And the doctors actually believed her until one of them discovered corn inside one of the rabbit's stomachs.
Just when I thought I heard about all the worst cults in history, this one had to come and blow them out of the water. This is Colonia Dignidad. They were a German torture cult hiding out in the Chilean wilderness after World War II, aka Yazis. And to show you how terrible they were, let me tell you a story. Now, as a quick reminder, if you want more info, you can check out the podcast. The leader of this cult was a known child abuser, and he wanted more Chilean boys to be brought to him. So he started a hospital in the community and used it as a trafficking system to get more children. One day, a young Chilean boy choked and was rushed to the hospital. And right when he got there, a nurse scooped him up, brought him to a room, and saved his life. But later that day, his sister arrived and asked a nurse when she could pick him up to take him home. And the nurse responded that they needed to monitor him for a few more days, which is pretty suspect in a choking case. So a few days later, she comes back and she's like, okay, can I get my brother? And the nurse tells her that he's not there anymore. And this is because the hospital had lawyers on staff that were drafting up adoption paperwork when young boys would come in. The cult was able to legally adopt boys in the community without the parents' consent, and the parents had not enough money to do anything about it. There are so many more stories about this place, and I had never heard of it before, so make sure you check out this week's episode for more info.
This woman was found deceased on a trail that I used to walk by myself all the time. I don't do many true crime cases anymore, but this one hits way too close to home. On August 6th, Rachel Morin's body was found in a tunnel not far from the Ma and Pa Trail in Bel Air, Maryland. The condition her body was found in immediately led authorities to treat this case as a homicide. The 37-year-old mother of 5 went missing after going for a run on the trail around 6 p.m. the previous evening, and she was reported missing by her boyfriend Richard Tobin at 11:30 p.m. Richard has a history of domestic abuse as recent as 2020, which quickly led people to make assumptions. But as of now, police say they have no solid leads and believe it could have been a random attack. There has also been a man who claims to know Rachel going around to news outlets saying that he found the body through visions, but according to authorities, that's a lie. Another thing I've noticed is news outlets calling this a hiking trail, which I think is misleading. It's a really popular walking trail and goes through many residential areas in Bel Air. The entrance in particular, where Rachel's car was parked, is literally in the neighborhood. People in the area I grew up think of this trail as friendly and safe, which is why it's such a shock. And it's important as women that we're always aware of our surroundings because it can happen anywhere. Although we shouldn't have to worry about being killed when all we want to do is go outside. Authorities are asking anyone who lives near or was on the trail that day to report anything they saw. They've already received over 100 tips, and I hope something leads to them finding out who did this to Rachel soon.
Blood-curdling facts that you wish you never knew. Part 31. Ever since she was a little girl, Jewel Shuping wanted to be blind. So in 2006, she poured drain cleaner in her eyes and blinded herself permanently, and now she says that she's happier than ever. Thanks to FDA regulations, only 10 insects and 35 fruit fly eggs are allowed in a single box of raisins. Cavities are actually contagious, and they can be passed from one person to another by kissing or sharing food. If you've ever donated blood, that blood could be in someone else's boner right now. The man in this photo is an American college student named Otto Warmbier, who's begging for mercy as he's on trial for allegedly stealing a poster in North Korea. Luckily, he returned back to the US, but he had irreversible brain damage, dying just 6 days later. In 2008, Bruce Pardo snuck into his ex's Christmas party and torched it with a gift-wrapped flamethrower. These 5 Australian children were playing in a bouncy castle when suddenly it was lifted 30 feet in the air by a gust of wind. Unfortunately, they were thrown out of the castle mid-air and plummeted to their deaths.
I was murdered by my best friends on a trip we took to Mexico. They abandoned me there and informed my family that my demise was due to alcohol poisoning. Can you believe that? What was meant to be an enjoyable vacation morphed into a horrifying ordeal from which I can't awaken. Literally. My name is Shane Keller Robinson. My lifeless body was discovered in a hotel room in Cabo San Lucas. My so-called friends conveyed to my parents that I succumbed to alcohol poisoning, but my autopsy report revealed a broken neck and other signs of violent trauma. A video surfaced online showing a woman assaulting me while a man stood idly by, offering no assistance. Ever since, my family has been relentlessly seeking justice. They've been yearning for answers, for someone to be held responsible for the atrocity that befell me. Yet, it seems their pleas fall on deaf ears. Despite the damning evidence, the FBI and federal prosecutors declared they won't be pressing criminal charges. It's a bitter pill to swallow that those allegedly responsible for my murder may never face the consequences. To add insult to injury, a recent report from Mexican police contradicts the initial autopsy, suggesting that I might have been alive for several hours before authorities arrived and declared me dead. I hope that one day, justice will prevail and my family can attain some semblance of peace. But for now, they grapple with shattered hopes and a profound sense of injustice that's hard to endure.
I was a trusted nurse, but my patients kept dying. My name is Jane Toppin, and I was a serial killer. It was the late 19th century in Massachusetts. I was an orphan, adopted by the Toppin family, but never felt loved. I sought solace in nursing, a profession where I could care for others and feel needed. But soon, I discovered a dark fascination. I started experimenting with my patients, altering their prescribed medications, observing their reactions. It was a perverse thrill, a power over life and death. One by one, my patients started dying. The elderly, the weak, even the robust and healthy. I was always there, holding their hands, watching the life drain from their eyes. I was dubbed the Angel of Death, but I was far from an angel. I poisoned my landlords, my foster sister, even a close friend. I reveled in the control, the ability to decide who lived and who died. In 1901, the Davis family, whom I had been caring for, started dying mysteriously. The local authorities grew suspicious. They exhumed the bodies and found lethal doses of atropine and morphine. The game was up. I was arrested, and during my trial, I confessed to 31 murders, although some believe the number could be as high as 100. I was declared insane and spent the rest of my life in an asylum. I was Jane Toppin, the nurse who killed for pleasure. Stay tuned for more stories.
This man murdered his entire family over a webcam model. Grant Amato from Florida originally worked in the medical field. He had a nursing job in Orlando, but he was actually terminated from this job. It was found that he had improperly administered at least 8 bottles of a sedative to patients. The hospital also suspected him of stealing substances. Now, after he failed to get a new job, he decided to set his sights on a career as a Twitch streamer. He again failed at this. He wasn't earning enough money to live off. He became withdrawn and was spending all of his time on the internet. He started to become obsessed with a webcam model named Sylvia. He ended up telling her about himself in private, expensive chats. He also started showering her with money to impress her. However, this whole time he was claiming that he was a wealthy Twitch streamer. He thought that the pair had a genuine connection and became infatuated. To try and maintain his fake lifestyle that he'd created, he began stealing money off his dad and his brother. He ended up stealing $200,000. Obviously, when his family found out about this, they confronted him. Learning about his infatuation with this model and addiction to speaking to her online, Grant's brother actually paid for him to go to a luxury rehab centre. However, Grant only managed to stay a few days. Grant's dad then gave him an ultimatum. He was allowed to stay back at the family house as long as he got a job, started seeing a therapist, and cut off the model. Grant, however, didn't follow through on his end of the deal. When his dad found that he was still in contact with the model, he kicked Grant out. On January the 24th, 2019, Grant broke into his parents' home and shot his mum. He then waited for his dad to get home and shot him too. His dad fell to the floor and tried to crawl away, but Grant stood over him and shot him. Once his dad was deceased on the floor, he picked up his hand and used his fingerprint to get into his phone. He then lured his brother to the house. Hours later, his brother arrived and he shot him in the face. Grant actually placed the weapon on his brother in order to try and frame him for the deaths. Grant pleaded not guilty but was sentenced to life without parole.
This is Aokigahara, the forest. This place has become a magnet for death over the years, and it's steeped in mystery. So Aokigahara is located on Mount Fuji in Japan. It's a very, very beautiful forest with tons of trees, but its dark history started centuries ago. So it's been claimed many times that Aokigahara is a place where ubasute is practiced, which is basically the practice of bringing an elderly family member out into the deep forest or up on a mountain, leaving them there, and then allowing them to die alone. According to researchers, this was happening in the 1800s in Aokigahara. The forest itself has also been claimed for hundreds of years to be the home of yurei, or the ghosts of many people, including the ghosts of those people who were left to die. And according to a lot of the mythologies, some of these spirits are not happy. They've even said that it's dangerous to be in that forest at night because of the vengeful ghosts that may be walking around the woods. In recent years, though, Aokigahara has gained the reputation of the forest. I'll just say the unaliving forest here because I don't want to be censored. Because it has become a magnet for people to come and take their own lives. The forest floor is littered nowadays with remnants and possessions of the dead. In 2003, for example, 105 bodies were found alone in that year in Aokigahara. And in 2010, it was reported that over 200 people had tried to take their own lives in the forest, with 53 of them being successful. It's estimated that there are hundreds of bodies that are still somewhere deep in the woods. I mean, it's a massive forest. Something about the forest that I've always thought was really eerie was the ropes. Oftentimes, those who venture deep into the forest leave a trail of rope, meaning that they may be pondering taking their own life, so they bring a rope with them so that if they do get lost deep in the woods, they have a rope that they can tug on that will lead them all the way out. But there are tons of ropes in the woods that lead to nowhere, meaning that the person who went in never came back out. It's really a tragic story because nobody knows exactly why so many people are choosing to end their lives in the woods. Some say that it's because it's such a beautiful place. A place that's really quiet and isolated from the busy Japanese society. Others attribute this to a 1961 novel called The Tower of Waves, which describes Aokigahara as the perfect place to die, essentially. Obviously, Logan Paul was canceled back in 2018 when he visited the forest and was making jokes around the body of somebody that he found there. But I'm sure that this forest still has so many more stories that have yet to be told.
Imagine being so angry at your co-workers that you feed them to pigs. Susan Monica from California was born as Stephen. After being honorably discharged from service in the Navy, she began living as a woman. In 1991, she bought a huge farm in Oregon and had a number of pigs and chickens. In 2013, she met Robert Haney. Now, they had an agreement that Robert would stay on the property while building a house on it from scratch. However, in December 2013, Robert's family were growing quite concerned. It had been around 2 months since they'd last heard from him, so they decided to head over to the farm to see what the matter was. Now, Monica greeted them when they arrived on the farm. She gave them the news that Robert had basically just up and left. However, his family were really concerned to see that Robert's trailer and his pet dog were actually just there on the farm. There was no way that he would just leave without taking his trailer and his dog. They filed a missing persons report, but it was very difficult for police to try and track Robert because he used to pay for everything in cash. All they knew is the last person to see him alive was Susan. However, during the investigation, police found that Susan's story just wasn't adding up. She told them a specific date that he'd apparently left the property. However, this didn't match with one transaction that the police were able to trace. He'd used the electronic benefits transfer card that he had at a nearby Walmart months after Susan claimed that he'd left the area. Police decided to search the property and made a hideous discovery. On the property, they found what they believed to be a severed human leg. When Susan was questioned, she changed her story again. She said that one day she'd randomly just found her pigs in a feeding frenzy. When she looked, she found out that they were eating Robert. She claimed that she shot him to put him out of his misery. However, when they questioned her further, she ended up eventually admitting that there was another body on her property. On the map of the farm, she drew an X and stated that that's where they would find Steve. Steve Delacino was a former employee of Susan's. He'd actually started working for her a year prior to Robert. According to Susan, one day she'd confronted Steve for stealing 2 of her guns. They ended up in a physical fight and apparently one of the guns went off and shot him. Now, neither of Susan's stories actually made sense. They didn't explain why both of the bodies were actually found hacked to pieces. She also kept changing her stories, and neither of them matched with the forensic evidence found at the scene. Steve had also actually suffered 4 gunshot wounds to the head, not 1. Susan was eventually sentenced to a life in prison with the possibility of parole after a minimum of 50 years.
This is the Jeffrey Epstein of the 1970s, John David Norman. He's one of the worst criminals in US history, and I'm sure you've never heard of him, so let's dive in. So throughout the 1960s, John David Norman was convicted of various sexual charges against children in California multiple times, and he was let out of jail almost every time, serving a very small sentence. But it was in Dallas in the 1970s when he started the Delta Project, a global sex trafficking scheme where he was selling young boys to older rich men and producing CP for clients. Now, his operation was huge, and it went, like I said, across the globe. He had clients in different countries all over the US, and John David Norman had been running this thing for years. Finally, though, in 1973, after a tip from someone in San Francisco, the police raided his apartment and found tons of evidence. They figured out that John David Norman had been running a mail-order business where people could subscribe to a monthly Boy, Man, Lover magazine. They would get newsletters and mail from his CP organization, the Delta Project, and Epic International. And now this is where the story gets a little bit fishy. So according to news reports and various police officers and officials that worked this case in the 70s, in John David Norman's apartment, they discovered a Rolodex, which held over 30,000 index cards. And these cards listed between 50 to 100,000 clients that had engaged with John David Norman's sex trafficking service all across the world. According to the police and news reports at the time, some of these clients included high-profile politicians, sports players, musicians, you name it. Extremely powerful people. But after the raid, he was only charged with possession of marijuana, conspiracy to commit sodomy, and contributing to the delinquency of a juvenile, and he was released on bail. He then fled the state, obviously, and started up his business in another city, and this connection would link him to one of America's most infamous serial killers. But what happened to Norman's Rolodex with the 30,000 clients that had engaged in sex trafficking with him? Well, it disappeared. No one was ever charged in connection with any of the crimes. And I'm not even kidding you. In interviews recently, people and investigators have been trying to figure out what happened to those cards so they could go back in time and figure out who all engaged in these nefarious activities with these kids. And even the police departments have no record of even possessing the cards. They literally disappeared. 30,000 names of these clients. They're just gone. And the police officers, to this day, don't know where they went. All of that, I think, is highly suspicious, but it's when we start looking into John David Norman's connections to notable serial killers that this story grows even darker, if that's possible. I'm running out of time here, but follow for a part 2.
We discovered a dead baby in the bathroom. Oh my gosh. I'm sorry. It came out of me and I didn't know what to do.
Lexi, I told you about this.
But it
I just asked you, baby, to tell me the truth.
scared. It was not crying or nothing.
What did you do to it?
Okay, stop right here.
Stop.
Where did you put the baby at? Tell me the truth. What did we put in there?
517-836-460.
That came out of your toilet? You put it in the bag?
Yes.
In what bag? Why did you say anything to us? Do you want to get in trouble for this now?
A horrifying piece of CCTV footage. A man tries to abduct a barista through the drive-thru window. Washington State Police have released this clip that occurred on Monday at around 5 a.m. of a man in his car trying to pull the barista out of the drive-thru window into his car whilst he's holding a zip tie device. She's seen just handling cash before he literally lurches out of the window and grabs her wrist, and the other hand has a zip tie. Thankfully, she managed to escape before he just sped off. Despite the terrifying nature of the crime, thankfully, due to the publication of the CCTV, police received loads of tips and actually arrested a suspect on Tuesday morning. The giveaway for the alleged suspect was actually the tattoo, which spelled Chevrolet. Not a very common tattoo, but led to a lot of people phoning in and even giving a name. Thank goodness she managed to get away. That is not okay.
What? Nothing there, mate. Nothing there. What? There's nothing there.
Today's case is one of these cases that you'll most likely recognise like the famous mugshot from. So this here is 18-year-old Shaylin Moran. At the time of what she did, she was 18 years old, and this takes place in 2019. She was from a place called Pawtucket, which is in America, and in the fall of October 2019, she met a boy online who she started a relationship with. This boy was called Leonard Trowfield, and I couldn't find any photos of him for some reason. On the first day that they met in person, the pair stayed at Leonard's house. However, after day 4, the pair got into quite the argument, where Shaylin had stormed out of the house and filed a police report against Leonard. And she had called assault, which Leonard absolutely denied was not true. The pair were then given a no-contact order. And the reason why I'm kind of leaning to believe Leonard is, I'll tell you why. So obviously when you're given a no-contact order, you cannot contact that person. But this didn't bother Shaylin. She was sending death threats to absolutely all of his family, including his dog. So after the breakup, she then very quickly met Jack Doherty, and together they had conspired that they were going to kill Shaylin's ex. And Jack was absolutely down for that. He was so ready to do it. They were sending each other texts like, if you do this, we'll be together forever, I love you, and all that. And at the end of December 2019, so we're literally talking 2 months later, Jack came down from New York to see Shaylin. Not only this, he also brought an engagement ring with him. And the pair were ready to go to her ex's house to commit a shooting. So Shaylin had actually stayed in a hotel nearby where the pair were staying. She didn't go with him, and they decided that they were just going to shoot whoever opened the door. So on January 1st, 2020, Jack Doherty went to the address of Leonard, and it was his mother, Cheryl Smith, that opened the door, and she was shot several times, which killed her. Another strange thing that I just want to know, I couldn't find many photos of Cheryl either. To which, after it took place, they then posted this on Facebook, which says, "We some fighters and some shooters." And she's also showing off her engagement ring in the post. Luckily, a detective that was responding to the shooting had saw this post that these two had posted. So, literally, just a couple hours later, they were arrested in the hotel room, which I just think is kind of funny, to be honest. Like, how stupid do you have to be? And the cops found the gun that was used in the shooting that matched the bullets found in Cheryl. Jack Doherty is still in prison awaiting trial, but because Shaylin was really the mastermind behind it, she knew what she was doing. She was sentenced to life in prison for her part on killing Cheryl Smith.
The case is still new. We're still discovering facts. Incomprehensible cruelty. The father that stands before you lined up his 3 young boys, and he executed them in his own home with a rifle. They were ages 3, 4, and 7, Judge. In an act of desperation to save her children, the mother at some point grabbed the gun. The father was able to flee into a field near the home. And again, we know from his admission, the father hunted that boy down, drug him back to the property, and executed him in front of witnesses. The mother was shot through the hand in her attempt to protect her children. To just begin to imagine their fear. This was the man that every day they woke up looking to for protection, love, guidance in all things. The man they trust more than any other person on earth. The person they rely upon to keep them safe from harm. He was their world, he was their guardian, and he executed them in cold blood. We know that from his admission. One of the most monstrous, craven, cowardly acts that will ever be our misfortune to see. To make things even more disturbing, Judge, this was no haphazard act. Again, by his own admission, he planned the acting on a whim. He's confessed to what I believe is the worst crime, at least I hope, that I'll see in my lifetime. I hope it's the worst fact pattern that ever comes before this court. Judge,
This 14-year-old boy is one of the UK's most dangerous killers. I'm True Crime Caitlin, and this is the murder of Joe Galen. Today's case takes place in Bury, Manchester in 2006. Joe is an 11-year-old, very well-liked, charismatic boy who loved everything to do with football and had cystic fibrosis. On the 1st of March, he receives a handwritten note from 14-year-old Michael Harmer, who had told Joe that this was a note from the deputy head teacher. The note instructed Joe that he had to go home with Michael that night, that he was his mentor, and that his mum was going to pick him up from there after school. Joe had mentioned the note to teachers who had questioned it, not believing that it had actually came from the deputy head teacher. This teacher was partway through advising Joe not to do it when the fire alarm went off, disrupting the conversation and forcing all the students to evacuate the school. Michael had in fact fabricated the note in order to lure Joe back to his house. He had developed some sort of obsession and fascination with Joe, and maybe experienced some sort of jealousy towards Joe. Michael was quite the opposite of him. He was very reserved, very quiet, and he didn't really have any friends. When the boys arrived at Michael's house after school, he proceeded to make sexual advances towards Joe. Joe rejected these advances, calling Michael gay, and threatened to tell everyone in school what Michael had just tried to do. Filled with rage and probably feeling extremely embarrassed, Michael picked up a frying pan and proceeded to bludgeon Joe with it. He whacked Joe a total of 5 times with so much force that it had broken his eye socket and broke the pan. After retrieving 2 knives, Michael would go on to stab poor Joe 16 times. Some wounds were up to 8 inches long, and he had been stabbed in the neck, face, and his upper body. After murdering Joe, Michael dragged his body downstairs, hauled him into a bin, and began to wheel him to nearby Whitehead Park. This was at around 4:30 p.m. Back at their home, the parents of Joe began to worry. He wasn't the type of boy who would wander about after school. He was very rarely late, and he needed medical treatment for his cystic fibrosis that without could be detrimental. They knew that something wasn't right, and at 5:30 p.m. they contacted the police and reported Joe missing. Thankfully, the police took this serious immediately and launched a search. Meanwhile, Michael had gone home and was completely normal. He'd ate his tea, done his homework, had a bath, and then proceeded to sleep soundly in the bedroom where only hours prior he had committed murder. The search went on late into the night. However, it wasn't until the next day, at around 10:30 a.m, that the body of 11-year-old Joe Galen was found by a police dog hidden under some debris. It was clear to the officers that found him that he was the victim of a vicious killing, thus turning the case from a missing person to a murder. People who were with Joe the day before or had any information on him whatsoever were all questioned. One of these people included Michael. He admitted that he had seen Joe after school, but that they had only just briefly spoke in the street before going their separate ways. But this didn't sit right with some of the school staff. Michael was changing his story, and then remembering the note, this just didn't add up for the staff. Within an hour of finding Joe's body, Michael is escorted out of the school and is arrested. Initially, he did try to deny any involvement with Joe's murder. However, after a few hours, he made a full confession. A search of his house would find the note that lured Joe to his house, along with several other ones where Michael had wrote his sexual interest in Joe. At Manchester Crown Court on the 16th of October, Michael pled guilty to murder and was given a life sentence with a minimum term of 12 years to serve. This was later uplifted to 15 years. In 2016, he made a plea to have his sentence reduced, which was denied. He was able to apply for parole in March 2021, but I couldn't find anywhere if he had or if he has been released or not. Next week will mark 17 years since poor Joe was callously killed. He was a happy, bright young boy who did not deserve the end he was met with.